Rome believed it could not be broken. For centuries, the Roman Republic had survived invasion, rebellion, and disaster. When enemies threatened the city, Rome answered with discipline, numbers, and relentless force. Legions marched where others fled. Defeat was temporary. Victory was inevitable. That belief had become Rome's greatest weakness. By 216 BC, the Republic was at war with a man unlike any enemy it had ever faced. Hannibal Barca had crossed mountains thought impossible. He had destroyed Roman armies again and again on Italian soil. Yet Rome refused to accept the truth standing before it. They believed one thing would end the nightmare: numbers. Rome gathered the largest army it had ever assembled, an army so vast it seemed impossible to defeat. 80,000 men, veterans, citizens, allies, senators' sons and farmers standing shoulder to shoulder. Steel, discipline, and confidence compressed into a single unstoppable mass. The plan was simple: find Hannibal, crush him, end the war. The Romans did not know they were marching into a killing ground. On a wide plain near the village of Cannae, under a burning summer sun, two armies faced each other. Dust hung thick in the air. The wind blew relentlessly, carrying sand and heat straight into Roman eyes. Across the field stood a smaller force, a mixture of Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and cavalry from distant lands. At their center stood Hannibal. He knew he could not win by strength. He could not outlast Rome. He could not retreat forever. So he chose something far more dangerous: deception. What would follow that day would echo through history as the most devastating defeat Rome ever suffered. Not a rout, not a retreat, but a methodical slaughter that lasted hours. An army crushed not by chaos, but by precision. By sunset, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers would lie dead where they stood. Generals, senators, friends and brothers pressed into the earth so tightly they could not even fall. Some suffocated before they were struck. Others begged for death. This was not just a battle. It was a lesson written in blood, and Rome would never forget it. Hannibal Barca had been shaped by war long before he ever faced Rome. Raised in an environment where conflict was not an event, but a way of life. From a young age, he was taught that Rome was not merely an enemy, but a threat that would never stop expanding until it was destroyed. According to tradition, his father made him swear an oath never to be a friend of Rome, binding his future to a single purpose. That promise was not symbolic, and Hannibal carried it with him into every decision he would later make. Unlike Roman commanders, Hannibal did not inherit rigid doctrines or political expectations about how wars were meant to be fought. He studied people as much as armies, learning how fear, pride, and impatience could be turned into weapons. Where Rome trusted discipline and repetition, Hannibal trusted adaptation and surprise. When war began, Hannibal did not wait for Rome to come to him, nor did he attempt to fight on predictable ground. Instead, he chose the most dangerous path possible, leading his army across the Alps into Italy itself. The journey nearly destroyed his force before the war had truly begun, as snow, starvation, and ambushes tore through his ranks. Many soldiers never reached Italy, dying on mountain paths that no Roman army had ever dared to cross. Those who survived emerged hardened, loyal, and accustomed to suffering, bound together by shared survival rather than shared nationality. Rome expected Hannibal to retreat or collapse after such losses, believing no army could endure such a march. Instead, Hannibal began dismantling Roman confidence piece by piece. At the Trebia River, Roman forces charged without preparation and were drawn into freezing waters where Hannibal's troops overwhelmed them. Thousands of Romans died, shocked not only by defeat, but by how easily their discipline had been manipulated. Soon after, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal orchestrated one of the most complete ambushes in military history. A Roman army marched blindly into fog, and narrow terrain, surrounded before it even realized a battle had begun. Men were slaughtered against the lakeshore, drowning as they tried to escape through the water. The defeat sent waves of panic through Rome, as entire legions vanished in a single morning. Yet Rome refused to negotiate, refused to retreat, and refused to accept that Hannibal might be superior. Instead, the Republic replaced fallen armies with new ones, convinced that persistence alone would secure victory. Hannibal understood something Rome did not yet grasp, that Rome could afford to lose battles far longer than he could. Every soldier Hannibal lost was irreplaceable, while Rome could summon fresh legions year after year. Because of this, Hannibal avoided reckless confrontation and chose his battles with extreme care. He allowed Rome to exhaust itself, to grow impatient, and to believe that decisive victory was always just one battle away. When Roman leadership argued over strategy, Hannibal waited. When cautious commanders were replaced by aggressive ones, Hannibal prepared. By the time both armies moved toward Cannae, Hannibal had already studied the terrain and the enemy's mindset. The wide, open plain offered exactly what the Romans wanted: space to deploy their massive formations and rely on sheer force. To Hannibal, it offered something else, a place where Roman numbers could be turned into a weakness. He noted the prevailing winds that would blow dust into Roman faces and the river that would limit their movement. More importantly, he understood how Roman confidence would push them forward without restraint. Hannibal arranged his army carefully, placing his weakest infantry in the center where the Romans would strike hardest. His strongest and most disciplined troops waited on the flanks, positioned to strike at the right moment. The cavalry, superior in both number and experience, was placed where it could quickly overwhelm Roman horsemen. Nothing about Hannibal's formation was accidental, and every movement was calculated long before the first sword was drawn. To the Romans, Hannibal's center appeared vulnerable and ready to break under pressure. To Hannibal, it was bait. He did not intend to defeat Rome quickly or cleanly. He intended to let Rome destroy itself. As the armies settled into position, Hannibal remained calm, knowing that the next day would decide the fate of thousands. He was not facing Rome's greatest general, but Rome's greatest mistake. And by the time the sun rose over Cannae, the trap was already in motion. The Roman army that marched toward Cannae represented the full weight of the Republic's confidence and desperation. Rome believed that if any force could finally end Hannibal's campaign, it would be an army assembled on a scale never seen before. Two consular armies were combined into one massive formation, a rare decision driven by panic as much as determination. Never before had Rome placed so many men under unified command in a single battle. More than 80,000 infantry filled the ranks, supported by cavalry and allied contingents drawn from across Italy. The army stretched across the countryside in long columns, kicking dust into the air as it moved south. Veterans who had survived earlier defeats marched beside fresh recruits who had never seen real combat. Fathers stood in line with sons, bound by duty and expectation rather than experience. Many of these men believed the war would end that day, that Hannibal would finally be crushed beneath Roman strength. The Senate had assured the people that overwhelming force would succeed where caution had failed. Roman commanders believed discipline and numbers would break any formation Hannibal could assemble. They did not believe strategy alone could overcome such superiority. Leadership of the army alternated between two consuls, men with opposing approaches to war. One urged restraint and careful maneuvering, aware of Hannibal's past victories. The other demanded immediate confrontation, confident that hesitation only prolonged Roman humiliation. On the day of battle, aggression prevailed. The army was ordered to advance directly toward Hannibal's position without delay. Roman infantry were arranged in unusually deep formations, designed to concentrate force at the center. The intention was simple: to drive straight through Hannibal's line and split his army in two. Cavalry was placed on the flanks, though in smaller numbers and with less experience than their opponents. The Romans trusted that the battle would be decided by infantry before cavalry could matter. They believed speed and pressure would secure victory before complications arose. As the army took its position, shields were locked and standards raised, creating a wall of iron and wood. The density of the formation left little room for movement, but Roman commanders saw this as a strength. They believed cohesion would prevent panic and ensure constant forward momentum. What they failed to consider was what would happen if momentum became confinement. The summer heat intensified as thousands of bodies stood pressed together beneath heavy armor, sweat-soaked tunics, and dust-coated faces before the first blow was struck. The prevailing wind carried grit into Roman eyes, reducing visibility and adding to the strain. None of this was seen as significant. The Romans had endured discomfort before and emerged victorious. They believed this battle would be no different. Across the field, Hannibal's army appeared thinner and less imposing. Roman officers interpreted this as proof that their enemy was weakened and vulnerable. They did not question why Hannibal had chosen such open ground. They did not consider why he seemed willing to face Rome directly at last. The Roman plan required absolute confidence and relentless forward pressure. Once committed, there would be no retreat until victory was secured. Signals were passed down the line, and the order to advance was given. Thousands of Roman soldiers stepped forward in unison, shields braced and weapons ready. The sound of marching feet grew louder as the distance between the armies closed. To the Romans, the enemy center already seemed to be yielding ground. This reinforced their belief that Hannibal could not withstand their advance. As the formation pressed forward, the Roman center grew tighter and deeper. Men were pushed from behind by the weight of those advancing. The ability to maneuver or withdraw diminished with every step. Roman commanders urged the men onward, convinced that victory lay just ahead. The idea of retreat did not exist in Roman thinking at that moment. Success had become an expectation rather than a possibility. The army was no longer a flexible force, but a single massive block moving forward. Any change in direction would require time and coordination the Romans did not have. Yet none of this seemed dangerous, while confidence remained intact. The Roman soldiers believed they were witnessing the collapse of Hannibal's line. They believed their enemies were retreating in fear. They believed the battle was already decided. What they did not realize was that their greatest advantage, overwhelming numbers, was being turned against them. Every step forward reduced their freedom to react. Every man added to the pressure on those ahead of him. The deeper they advanced, the more difficult it became to see anything beyond the shields in front of them. Orders struggled to travel through the compressed mass of bodies. Sound was swallowed by movement and noise. Individual soldiers could no longer tell where they were on the battlefield. They could only move forward because there was nowhere else to go. This was exactly what Roman commanders wanted. It was also exactly what Hannibal had anticipated. By committing fully and without hesitation, the Roman army surrendered its ability to adapt. The battle had not yet reached its most violent phase, but the outcome was already being shaped. The Romans believed they were executing their own strategy. In reality, they were walking deeper into a trap designed specifically for them. By the time doubt appeared among the ranks, space would be gone. And when space disappears on a battlefield, survival follows shortly after. Dawn broke over the plain of Cannae beneath a sky already heavy with heat and dust. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the field where two armies stood waiting. A thin haze lingered in the air, stirred by the movement of thousands of feet and the restless shifting of men in armor. Roman soldiers tightened their grips on shields and weapons, adjusting straps and glancing forward toward the enemy lines. The smell of sweat, leather, and dust hung thick even before the fighting began. Orders moved down the Roman ranks, passed by, shouted command, and repeated from man to man. The army responded with discipline, stepping forward as one massive body. From a distance, the Roman formation appeared unstoppable, a solid wall of iron advancing across open ground. Confidence spread through the ranks as the enemy seemed to wait rather than advance. Many Roman soldiers believed Hannibal had chosen to stand only because he had no other option. They interpreted his stillness as hesitation. As the distance closed, the noise of movement grew louder, metal shifting against metal, sandals grinding into the dry earth. The wind began to rise, blowing steadily toward the Roman line and carrying dust directly into their faces. Eyes stung and vision blurred, but the formation continued forward without pause. No one slowed, and no one questioned the conditions. Across the field, Hannibal watched the Roman advance in silence. He observed the growing density of their formation and the steady pressure pushing the center forward. Everything was unfolding as expected. At his signal, the center of his line began to give ground, retreating slowly and deliberately. To the Romans, it looked like weakness. The enemy line curved inward as it fell back, appearing to bend under the weight of Roman pressure. Shouts of encouragement rippled through the Roman ranks as soldiers pushed harder, convinced the breakthrough was beginning. Officers urged the men onward, calling for greater effort and faster advance. The Roman formation tightened further as men pressed forward to exploit the perceived collapse. What they could not see was how their own movement was shaping the battlefield. The center pushed ahead, but the flanks struggled to keep pace. Gaps opened, then disappeared, as pressure from behind forced the line inward. The Romans were no longer advancing as a broad front. They were advancing as a wedge, driven forward by their own momentum. Dust thickened as the fighting lines closed. Visibility dropped, and individual soldiers could see little beyond the shields in front of them. Communication became more difficult as sound was swallowed by noise and movement. Still, confidence remained. Roman soldiers believed victory was moments away. Hannibal's center continued to fall back, step by step, drawing the Romans deeper into the field. The retreat was controlled and disciplined, though it appeared chaotic to those watching from a distance. The Romans did not recognize the pattern. They had never seen an enemy willingly give ground on such a scale. Each step forward felt like confirmation of Roman superiority. The press of bodies grew tighter, reducing the ability to raise weapons or maneuver freely. Some soldiers found themselves unable to swing their swords fully. Others struggled to maintain balance as the formation surged and stalled. The wind intensified, blowing dust and grit into open mouths and eyes. Breathing became more difficult beneath heavy armor and rising heat. Yet no order to slow or halt was given. Roman commanders were focused on maintaining pressure, believing any pause might allow the enemy to recover. The enemy center now formed a shallow curve, bending inward toward the Roman advance. To the Romans, it looked like a line on the verge of breaking. To Hannibal, it was the moment he had been waiting for. On the flanks, his African infantry remained steady and unmoving. Their discipline contrasted sharply with the apparent disorder in the center. Roman soldiers noticed them only vaguely, too focused on the retreating enemy ahead. The cavalry on both sides began to engage, their movements partially obscured by dust and distance. The sounds of battle intensified, shouting, clashing metal, and the cries of wounded men. Still, the Roman center continued to push forward relentlessly. They were now fully committed, deep within Hannibal's formation. Retreat was no longer an option. The weight of thousands behind them made turning back impossible. What had begun as a confident advance was becoming a compressed mass of bodies driven by momentum alone. The Romans had achieved exactly what they wanted: penetration of the enemy center. They did not realize that penetration without control leads to collapse. Hannibal gave no immediate signal. He allowed the Romans to advance further, to exhaust themselves physically and mentally. Every moment increased the pressure and reduced their ability to respond. The battlefield narrowed around them, shaped by their own movement. The sun climbed higher, beating down on metal and flesh alike. Sweat streamed into eyes already irritated by dust. Breathing became labored, and exhaustion set in earlier than expected. Yet Roman discipline held, and the advance continued. Confidence had not yet turned into doubt. That transformation would come later. The Roman soldiers believed they were winning. They did not know that the moment of victory had already passed, and as the morning wore on, the space around them continued to disappear. The turning point of the battle did not arrive with a shout or a signal that the Romans could recognize. It arrived quietly, as the forward movement of the Roman center began to slow under its own weight. The soldiers at the front found themselves pressed tightly together, their momentum reduced by bodies rather than enemy resistance. Behind them, thousands more continued to push forward, unaware that the advance was beginning to stall. The retreating enemy center had reached the position Hannibal had chosen carefully in advance. At that moment, the withdrawal stopped. Hannibal's center held firm, no longer giving ground. To the Romans, this sudden resistance felt like stubborn desperation. They pressed harder, convinced that one final surge would break the enemy completely. Instead, they met a wall that did not collapse. As the Roman center struggled forward, movement on the flanks began to change. Hannibal's African infantry, previously stationary, pivoted inward with practiced precision. Their movement was subtle at first, barely noticeable amid the chaos. Then it became unmistakable. Roman soldiers on the edges of the formation felt pressure from the sides, something they had not anticipated. What had been a straight advance was becoming a narrowing corridor. At the same time, the cavalry battle reached its conclusion. Hannibal's horsemen, superior in both numbers and experience, drove the Roman cavalry from the field. Some Roman riders were cut down where they stood. Others fled, abandoning the infantry to its fate. With the Roman flanks exposed, Hannibal's cavalry did not pursue for long. They turned back toward the center of the battlefield. The sound of hooves grew louder as they approached from behind the Roman formation. The realization came slowly, spreading unevenly through the ranks. Roman soldiers began to sense that something was wrong. The pressure around them increased from all directions. The space they had relied on to fight and move was disappearing. Officers attempted to issue new orders, but commands struggled to travel through the compressed mass. Signals were lost in noise, dust, and confusion. The Roman formation was no longer responding as a unified force. It was breaking into isolated clusters, each reacting independently. The African infantry continued to close inward, shields locked and weapons controlled. Their movement was disciplined and deliberate, not rushed. They did not need speed. The Romans were already trapped. As the circle tightened, Roman soldiers at the edges were the first to fall. Those facing inward were struck from the sides, unable to turn or retreat. Those at the rear felt pressure as cavalry closed the final gap. What had once been open ground was now a confined space filled with bodies. The Romans could no longer see the shape of the battle. They could only see the men immediately around them. Panic began to replace confidence. The realization that there was no escape spread faster than any order could counter it. Some soldiers tried to force their way backward, only to be crushed by the weight behind them. Others attempted to push outward, meeting solid lines of enemy shields and spears. The Roman army had advanced too far and too tightly to respond effectively. Their own formation had become a prison. Hannibal watched as the final stage of the trap closed. He did not need to issue many commands. The battle now moved according to momentum rather than intention. Roman discipline, once their greatest strength, now worked against them. Men continued to follow orders that no longer made sense. They pushed forward into a space that no longer existed. The cavalry completed the encirclement, sealing the Roman army completely. There was no open flank, no rear, no path of retreat. The Romans were surrounded on all sides. The scale of the disaster became clear only gradually. This was not a temporary setback or a threatened breakthrough. It was total containment. Every Roman soldier on the field was now trapped within Hannibal's formation. The sun climbed higher as the realization spread. Heat and exhaustion intensified as movement became more difficult. Breathing grew harder beneath armor and rising panic. The sound of battle changed from the clash of advancing lines to the noise of desperation. Cries for help mixed with shouted orders that no longer had meaning. Hannibal's soldiers pressed inward steadily, maintaining formation and conserving energy. They did not rush the killing. Time was on their side. The Romans had nowhere to go and no way to reorganize. With each passing moment, the space within the encirclement shrank. Bodies fell and remained where they lay, further reducing movement. Men stumbled over the wounded and the dead, unable to stop or assist them. The battlefield became a confined mass of struggling soldiers rather than a field of maneuver. Hannibal's trap had closed completely. What remained was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was the beginning of a prolonged slaughter. Once the encirclement was complete, the battle entered a phase that few Roman soldiers could have imagined. There was no longer a front line, no clear direction of attack, and no space to maneuver. The Roman army existed now as a compressed mass of men surrounded on all sides by an enemy that controlled the pace. Hannibal's soldiers did not charge wildly or seek quick victory. They advanced slowly, tightening the circle with deliberate precision. Roman soldiers at the edges were the first to suffer. Those facing outward were attacked from multiple directions at once. Those facing inward found their movement blocked by their own comrades. Swords became difficult to swing in the tight space. Shields overlapped unintentionally, trapping arms and restricting movement. Some soldiers dropped their weapons simply to breathe. The pressure within the mass increased as more bodies fell. The wounded collapsed where they stood, unable to be moved. Those behind them were forced to stand atop the fallen. Men struggled to keep their footing on ground, slick with blood and dust. Breathing grew labored as heat, exhaustion, and fear combined. The sun continued to rise, baking armor and flesh alike. Roman discipline, so effective in open combat, began to break under these conditions. Commands were shouted, but few could tell who was giving them or where they came from. Officers attempted to restore order, but many were cut down before they could be seen or heard. The chain of command dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance. Each group fought independently, unaware of what was happening elsewhere on the field. Some soldiers attempted to force gaps in the encirclement, only to be repelled immediately. Others tried to retreat inward, hoping the pressure might ease toward the center. Instead, the center became the most crowded and dangerous place of all. Men were packed so tightly that they could not fall even when struck. Some suffocated standing upright, crushed by the weight of bodies around them. The noise of battle changed from organized shouts to constant screams and desperate cries. Steel struck armor at close range. Blows landed without room for proper force. Many wounds were inflicted not by clean strikes, but by repeated stabbing in confined space. Hannibal's troops rotated gradually, allowing exhausted men to withdraw while fresh soldiers pressed forward. The Romans had no such relief. They fought continuously, with no escape and no replacement. Hours passed, though few soldiers could have measured time accurately. The battle became a test of endurance rather than tactics. Exhaustion claimed men as surely as enemy blades. Some soldiers collapsed simply from heat and lack of air. Others continued fighting mechanically, driven by instinct rather than command. The dust and blood in the air made it difficult to see or breathe. Vision blurred as sweat and grime coated faces and eyes. The ground beneath the Roman army disappeared under layers of bodies. Movement became even more restricted as the dead accumulated. Those still standing were forced to remain upright by the press of bodies around them. The weight of the fallen pressed inward, increasing the pressure on those still alive. Hannibal remained patient. He did not rush the slaughter or seek to end it quickly. Every Roman soldier trapped inside the circle represented a threat that had to be eliminated completely. There would be no prisoners taken from the mass. Roman attempts at organized resistance faded as exhaustion and panic spread. Some soldiers threw down their weapons in desperation, hoping for mercy. Few received it. Hannibal's men understood that allowing any escape risked the collapse of the trap. The encirclement tightened further as the circle shrank inward. Each contraction reduced the space available to the Romans. The sound of fighting became more muffled as bodies absorbed movement and noise. Only screams and the clash of metal cut through the suffocating press. Roman soldiers could no longer tell where the enemy began or ended. The battlefield was no longer defined by formations, only by survival. As the day wore on, the Romans began to realize the full extent of their destruction. This was not a temporary setback that could be reversed with effort. This was annihilation, unfolding slowly and deliberately. The hope of escape faded with every passing moment. Some soldiers fought on simply because stopping meant death. Others fought because there was nothing else they could do. The sun climbed toward its highest point, casting light over a field that had become unrecognizable. Where once two armies had stood, there was now a single mass of struggling men surrounded by death. Hannibal's strategy had achieved complete success. The Roman army was not being defeated in waves or phases. It was being erased. When the fighting finally slowed, it was not because mercy had been shown, but because there were few Romans left capable of resisting. The field of Cannae fell into an uneasy silence broken only by the sounds of the wounded and dying. Bodies covered the plain in every direction, packed so tightly that the ground beneath them could no longer be seen. Roman soldiers lay where they had stood, where they had fallen, and where they had been crushed by the weight of others. Many had never moved from their positions, dying upright before collapsing hours later. The scale of the destruction became clear only as Hannibal's men stepped back and surveyed the field. Tens of thousands of Roman infantry lay dead, their armor dulled by dust and blood. Among them were senators, nobles, officers, and veterans who had once formed the backbone of the Republic's armies. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus was counted among the dead, struck down while attempting to rally his men. Entire command structures had vanished in a single day. Those Romans who survived did so by chance rather than strategy. Small groups managed to break free early in the chaos, fleeing toward nearby towns under cover of confusion. Others survived only because they had been wounded and left beneath piles of bodies. As darkness approached, Hannibal ordered the battlefield secured. The killing had achieved its purpose. His soldiers moved among the dead, stripping armor, collecting weapons, and searching for survivors. Rings were removed from the fingers of fallen Roman nobles, gathered as proof of the scale of the victory. According to later accounts, these rings filled entire containers. The numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. More than 50,000 Romans dead in a single battle. Some ancient sources claimed even higher figures. Never before had Rome lost so many men in one day. Never again would it suffer such concentrated destruction. News of the defeat traveled quickly. Messengers reached Rome carrying words that few believed at first. Another army destroyed, another disaster. But this time, the loss was beyond replacement. Panic spread through the city as families waited for names that would never be called. The Senate met in silence, preparing for the possibility that Hannibal would march directly on Rome itself. For the first time in generations, the Republic feared annihilation. Emergency measures were enacted as the city prepared for siege. Young boys and old men were armed. Walls were repaired. Prayers were offered to gods who had failed them. Yet Hannibal did not come. Instead of marching on Rome, he remained in the south, consolidating alliances and allowing the shock of Cannae to spread. His decision baffled Roman leaders and later historians alike, but Hannibal understood that Rome was not defeated by fear alone. It was defeated slowly, through exhaustion and loss of confidence. Cannae shattered Rome's belief in invincibility. From that day forward, Roman strategy changed fundamentally. They avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal whenever possible. Instead, they adopted a war of attrition, refusing decisive battle and targeting supply lines. Rome would never again commit its entire strength to a single engagement without caution. The lesson of Cannae was burned into Roman memory. In the years that followed, Rome rebuilt its armies not with confidence, but with discipline sharpened by fear. They learned patience. They learned restraint. They learned that overwhelming force meant nothing if misused. Though Hannibal never captured Rome, his victory at Cannae echoed for centuries. Military commanders studied the battle as a perfect example of encirclement and annihilation. Generals from distant eras would attempt to replicate the maneuver, often without success. The name Cannae became synonymous with total defeat. For Rome, survival after Cannae became a defining achievement. The Republic endured, adapted, and eventually prevailed in the long war. But the cost was permanent. An entire generation of Roman men had been erased in a single afternoon. Families were destroyed. Political careers ended abruptly. The memory of Cannae haunted Roman culture long after the war itself had ended. It served as a reminder that Rome's power had limits, that discipline could become rigidity, that confidence could become blindness. For Hannibal, Cannae was the height of his career. He would never again command such a decisive victory. Despite his genius, the war dragged on until Rome's resources overwhelmed him. History would remember Rome as the final victor, but it would never forget Cannae, because on that day, Rome did not simply lose a battle. It lost the illusion that it could never be defeated, and the field where tens of thousands fell became a warning written into history itself, a reminder that even the greatest empires can be brought to the edge of extinction in a single day.